All right, well, yeah, let's get started. First of all, it's great to see you all. I haven't seen you all, some of you, since last year. Most of you I saw in December, so it's great to see you. Of course, if you don't know, I've been teaching in the mountains of Colorado for the past year, so I'm very glad to be back in relatively normal weather, where it doesn't snow in May. It has snowed multiple times in May, where I'm from. And it's always a little bit intimidating to be asked to speak or preach at Park Woods, because Jeff always does such a good job, and you know, a prophet has no honor in his hometown. So you all know me too well. I thought today would be a good opportunity to revisit a topic that I spoke on here a couple of years ago. Maybe it's like 3 years ago now. A few years ago, I did a series on Luther's theology of the cross, and in that series, I covered Pelagianism. So what I did for this week was I took that section where I talked about Pelagianism, and I took it as an opportunity to go back to Augustine's anti-Pelagian writings and sort of refresh myself and expand this section on Pelagianism. Pelagianism has a long history going back to the 5th century, and the 5th century is when it started, and late 4th century. Of course, legalism goes back to all the way back to the New Testament books like Colossians, legalism being an improper emphasis on the law. But it wasn't until the 5th century that the church had to seriously wrestle with the issues that were raised by Pelagius. That is, the issues of the doctrines of sin and the doctrine of grace. I just want to point out, before I start, that I want to commend this resource to you. A lot of the information that I used is provided by this guy named Roland J. Teskey. I don't know if I'm saying his name correctly, but this is a new translation of the works of Augustine. It's called The Works of St. Augustine, a translation for the 21st century. It's the most recent translation of Augustine's works. I think it was done in 1997, and it's like kind of an NIV of Augustine's writings. And I would highly commend it over the Nicene and post-Nicene Fathers, which was translated in like 1887 and is the version that most people use. Not only is this a great translation, I mean, of course, I can't speak to the faithfulness of the translation, but it's highly readable. But it also has really great introductions, and it's really helpful for understanding what's going on. So a lot of the information that I have for this Sunday school came from the introductions and, of course, from Augustine's writings. So I want to talk a little bit about the history of the Pelagian Controversy before I talk about what is Pelagianism itself. The Pelagian Controversy took place in the second decade of the 5th century, took place between about 410 and 420, and more specifically between 411 around and 418, which was when the Council of Carthage met and, spoiler alert, finally condemned Pelagius' views. So in this whole controversy, Augustine is responding to the views of 3 men. There were 3 main proponents of the view today that we call Pelagianism. The first is kind of a shadowy figure that we don't know a whole lot about, as far as I know, and his name is Rufinus the Syrian. I don't know if it's Rufinus or Rufinus, but he was a priest from Palestine, and he was probably the real founder of the view that we call Pelagianism today. He came to Italy in 399 and was active teaching and preaching in Rome. And in Rome, he met and influenced both Pelagius and Celestius, who are the 2 other figures who are associated with these views. So number 2 is Celestius. And Celestius, we know more about him than we know about Rufinus. Celestius was a lawyer of noble birth. He became a disciple of Pelagius around 390, and he was also influenced by Rufinus, as I said. He tried to be ordained as a priest in 411, but he ended up being brought up on charges of heresy by a bishop named Pelagius of Milan. And he was condemned by a gathering of bishops at Carthage in 411. Then there were about 50 councils of Carthage during this time. There was another council of Carthage in 416 that condemned him. And then the Pope condemned Celestius in January 417. That was Pope Innocent. But after he died, the next Pope, Pope Zosimus, he reversed that condemnation. But then, after pressure from Augustine and the bishops of Africa, Zosimus reversed that reversal in 418, in March of 418, so that Celestius was condemned again. In April 418, the Roman emperor got in on the action and condemned Pelagius and Celestius and banned them both from Rome. So Celestius' teachings, along with those of Pelagius, were then finally condemned at the last Council of Carthage, this time in May 418. So those are the first two figures. Then you have, obviously, Pelagius himself. Now, Pelagius was a British monk and theologian who was active in Rome during 390 to about 410. And Pelagius was a moral reformer, and he was especially concerned with Christian obedience. In 415, a complaint was brought against him by Orosius, who was a Spanish priest and a disciple of Augustine, along with two other bishops, Hieros of Arles and Lazarus of Aix. Not really important that you know those names, but this complaint resulted in a very important, a very interesting council called the Council of Diospolis, a Council of Diospolis. And that was held around December 20th, 415. Now, in that council, 6 statements from Pelagius, from his book called the Book of Chapters, or the Book of Testimonies, were brought into question. And I'll just read you the 6 just out of interest. Number 1, only one who has knowledge of the law can be without sin. Number 2, all are governed by their own will. Number 3, on the day of judgment, the wicked and sinners are not to be spared. Rather, they are to be burned with eternal fire. Number 4, evil does not even enter one's thoughts. Number 5, the kingdom of heaven was promised even in the Old Testament. And number 6, and this is the one that we'll focus on, there are a couple that we could, but this especially, Pelagius said that human beings can be without sin if they want. So these bishops had these sentences before them, these quotes from Pelagius' works as drawn up by these two bishops, Hieros and Lazarus, and they had to decide whether Pelagius was orthodox or whether his teachings were out of line with the Catholic Church. And in the end, this council actually acquitted Pelagius of all charges. Now, there were several reasons for this. First of all, the two bishops, Hieros and Lazarus, who drew up the charges, weren't present at the council because one of them had fallen seriously ill. So I don't know why the other one couldn't come, but apparently they both couldn't come because one of them had fallen seriously ill. So all the council had to go on at this Council of Diospolis, all the council had to go on were the written charges against Pelagius and the testimony of Pelagius himself. I think they had the writings of Pelagius, but that raises another issue. The 14 bishops who presided over his trial were all Greek-speaking, while Pelagius' writings were entirely in Latin. So they had a lot of trouble reading the writings. In number 3, Pelagius, in testifying before the bishops, he denied that he had written some of the passages in question and gave satisfactory answers to others. For example, against the charge that he had taught that evil does not even enter one's thoughts, well, first of all, we got to figure out what does that mean. That's just one sentence. Pelagius insisted that he had been quoted incorrectly. He had actually said, he insisted, that a Christian ought to strive not to think evil, right? And that's a sentence that anyone can get behind. And he even agreed, at this Council of Diospolis, he even agreed to condemn people who held the views that he was charged with. He said, to satisfy the Holy Synod, I declare anathema those who hold these views or have at some time held them. Now, Augustine, although being very generous, very gracious to Pelagius and in evaluating what he said, ultimately concluded that Pelagius had lied to the bishops about his views. And there was a gotcha moment that Augustine was able to bring up that we'll get to in a little bit. So the synod concluded, now since we are satisfied with the explanations of the monk Pelagius, here present, who is in agreement with sound doctrines and rejects the condemned views contrary to the faith of the Church, we recognize that he is in communion with the Catholic Church. Nevertheless, it's important to note that at this council, the Council of Diospolis, they actually condemned Pelagianism. So they condemned everything that Pelagius was accused of teaching, but they just acquitted Pelagius himself because he was able to answer them to their satisfaction. Now, Pelagius' opponents, including Augustine, were stunned by the council's decision. And to make matters worse, Pelagius caused a lot of confusion in the church because before the official account of the proceedings were made public, Pelagius wrote a letter to a priest friend of his in which he claimed that the council had approved his statement that human beings can be without sin and easily keep the commandments of God. So that was sent out before the official proceedings of the council were made known. So now everybody's thinking, well, maybe Pelagius is Orthodox. Did they approve Pelagius? We don't know. This caused confusion in the church. Now, in the Deeds of Pelagius, where all of this drama is recounted, and Augustine has received the official proceedings of the Council of Diospolis. Augustine, as I said, is very generous to Pelagius, but he's also generous to the bishops that were involved. There were 14 bishops that judged Pelagius at this council. Augustine didn't condemn the bishops at the council, but he argued that if they would have been more familiar with Pelagius, as Augustine was, then they would have condemned him. Or if they'd had these two people who brought Pelagius up on charges, then the outcome might have been different. However, long story short, in 418, Pelagius and his views were finally condemned at the Council of Carthage. So even after that, Augustine, he was sure, and like I said, in a minute we'll see a kind of a gotcha moment. Augustine was sure that Pelagius had not represented his views adequately at the synod, at the council. So that's kind of part, at least a little interesting part of the history of Pelagius. Are there any questions before I move on and we talk a little bit about what is Pelagianism?
How do you spell Ospolus?
Oh, yeah, D-I-O-S. No, D as in dog. D-I-O-S-P-O-L-I-S. The Council of Diospolus, or sometimes it's called the Synod of Diospolus. All right, so let's move on and let's think about what is Pelagianism. Because Pelagianism is interesting and important to understand, as I think if you understand Pelagianism better, we can understand our own Reformed heritage a lot better. Because of course we are Augustinian in the Reformed heritage. So first of all, Pelagianism can be understood as a pastoral or a moral theology. Pelagius was concerned first and foremost with Christian obedience and moral reform. Christians, Pelagius insisted, must take seriously the call to obey God. Now, Pelagius, what really set him off was a prayer, a famous prayer of Augustine that you can read in Augustine's Confessions. Augustine prayed, God, command what you will and give what you command. He prayed, command what you will and give what you command. Pelagius was at church one Sunday and he heard this quoted in a sermon by the bishop who was preaching, and it made him so mad that he almost got into a fist fight with the bishop who quoted it. Can you imagine that, Jeff?
Yes.
It made him really mad. He wrote a letter, a very famous letter, to a woman named Demetrius. And in this letter, he expressed concern at this notion, that the notion that humans must be able to do what God commands. That's what Augustine's prayer implies, right? Augustine prayed, command what you will, give what you command. That implies that by our nature, we are not able to obey what God commands. So God has to help us do that. And Pelagius didn't like that. If God commands what humans are unable to do, Pelagius said, then that makes him unrighteous and cruel even. And it also, for Pelagius, would undercut human responsibility. See, Pelagius thought that Augustine's teaching threatened not only compromised Christian obedience, but it actually made God unjust. So for Pelagius, this could not stand. So that's kind of the immediate background. In general, you could say that the Pelagian Controversy concerned two main questions. One is, what are the effects of the fall on man, that is, original sin? And number two, in what manner must man be harnessed by grace to be set and kept on the way to salvation? So what are the effects of fall on man, and how does grace have to harness man in order for him to be set and kept on the way of salvation, right? So we're basically asking questions about anthropology, the doctrine of man, and soteriology, the doctrines of grace. This is how Augustine, at the end of his book, The Deeds of Pelagius, this is the one where he recounted that trial and gave his opinion on it, the trial at the Council of Diospolis. This is how Augustine summarized Pelagius' teachings, and we'll unpack this after I tell it to you. He said, "After the heresies of old, a heresy has now been invented, not by bishops or priests, or by any clerics, but by certain monks. As if it were defending free choice, it argues against the grace of God, which we have through Jesus Christ our Lord. It tries to undermine the foundation of the Christian faith, of which Scripture says, 'Death came through one man, and the resurrection of the dead came through one man. For just as all die in Adam, so also all will be brought to life in Christ.' It rejects God's help in our actions, saying that human nature, which is created with free choice, can suffice for our not sinning and for our attaining righteousness. It says that it is God's grace that we have been created so that we can do this by our will, and that He has given us the help of the law and His commandments, and that He pardons the past sins of those who return to Him. It holds that we should acknowledge the grace of God only in these areas, but not as in a help for our individual actions, for people can be without sin and easily keep God's commandments if they want." So there's a lot in there, and I want to unpack that in 3 main points here. So 3 main points of Pelagius' teaching. Number 1, Pelagius denied original sin. Pelagius denied original sin. Original sin, of course, refers to the sinful state and condition in which all men are born. Original sin says that there is a connection between Adam and the whole human race, such that because of the sin of Adam, the whole human race was born into sin. Right? And we know this well as Reformed people. But Pelagius denied that Adam's sin is in any way passed on to his descendants. Rather, Pelagius argued, humans aren't born sinful. Humans become sinful by imitating Adam. So the problem for Pelagius, he doesn't deny that sin exists, but Pelagius says it's not inborn into us. Pelagius says the problem is that there are so many bad examples in the world. There's so much sin out there that when we're born, we end up imitating the bad example of others and thus becoming sinners ourselves. So for Pelagius, in other words, we're sinful because we sin. We don't sin because we're sinful. Pelagius said this is Augustine quoting Pelagius. He said that everything good or evil for which we deserve either praise or blame is not something with which we are born, but is something we do. For we are born capable of each of them, but not filled with either of them. And as we are begotten without virtue, so we are begotten without vice. And before the act of our own will, there is in a human being only what God created. So that's Pelagius' way of denying original sin. There's no inborn tendency to sin in human beings. Now that's huge, right? There's a reason in Reformed theology that the T comes first in tulip, right? It's not just because it spells tulip, but it's also foundational for all of the doctrines of grace. So because Pelagius denied original sin, Pelagius also argued that the human will, after the fall, is completely free to choose between good and evil. Pelagius says that because human nature was not harmed by the fall of Adam, man, after the fall, has no disposition either towards good or evil. So Pelagius says there's no moral difference between man after the fall and man before the fall. Pelagius here is espousing what we would call libertarian free will. Libertarian free will, there's a couple of ways you could explain it. The way that I like to use is the illustration of the ice cream shop. So I know that George loves ice cream. I just made that up, but I'm sure he likes ice cream. But say that George goes into an ice cream shop, okay? And George has libertarian free will. So according to Pelagius, George doesn't favor one ice cream over the other. Say there's, and now, work with me here, people. Say there's an ice cream shop that only serves chocolate or vanilla, okay? We're not going to Baskin-Robbins here. We're going to an ice cream shop that only serves chocolate or vanilla. So according to Pelagius, George is not inclined to choose either chocolate or vanilla. He's completely free. When he makes a choice to buy chocolate or vanilla ice cream, it isn't because of something inside him. It's just a completely free, arbitrary choice on George's part. And that's what Pelagius was saying about the human will. Pelagius said that the human will has neither a disposition to sin nor a disposition to do good. It's our choice. Every individual action is an arbitrary, completely unfettered, unguided, free choice that we make, and we're not inclined to choose either good or evil. So this means, and this is one of the things that Pelagius often talked about, this means that it is possible that someone after the fall could theoretically live a sinless life. And in fact, Pelagius thought that some of the Old Testament saints actually had been sinless. And again, this, for Pelagius, this comes back to a concern for Christian obedience. Right? Pelagius was all about obedience. So those are the first two pillars of Pelagius' teaching. Number one, Pelagius denied original sin. Number two, Pelagius argued that the human will after the fall is completely free to choose between good and evil. And number three, and this is the most important one and the most exciting one if you ask me, Pelagius redefined grace. Pelagius redefined grace. For Pelagius, grace means something very different than it did for Augustine and for us. Now, Pelagius, one of the problems that Augustine had with Pelagius is that a lot of times he was confusing about what he meant when he used the word grace. But for Pelagius, Augustine concluded, and we'll see this, grace, listen now, for Pelagius, grace is the natural human faculties. For Pelagius, grace is the natural human faculties. Pelagius argued that man has the natural ability to obey God's commandments. By nature, we're not inclined to evil. By nature, we have the ability to obey God's commandments. And, Pelagius argued, this is grace because God created man with that ability. So man has the natural ability to obey God's commandments, and this is grace because God created man with that ability. Now, of course, again, all of this presupposes original sin or denial of original sin, and that the human will after the fall is free to do good or evil. But this is a really important claim. For Pelagius, grace is nature. For Pelagius, grace is swallowed up by nature. Here's what Pelagius said, again quoted by Augustine. I don't think we have any of Pelagius' writings, so all we have is Augustine to go by. So Pelagius says, the ability not to sin lies not so much in the power of choice as in the necessity of nature. Whatever lies in the necessity of nature undoubtedly pertains to the author of nature, namely God. How then can one suppose that what is shown to pertain to God as his very own is said to exist apart from God's grace? So for Pelagius, grace isn't supernatural. Grace isn't something that comes to us from outside. It's not divine help. We don't pray to God and then He helps us from heaven. He empowers us by His Holy Spirit to obey. For Pelagius, grace is natural. Grace is located in the human faculties. For Augustine, by contrast, grace is supernatural. Grace is help that comes to us from outside of us by God. This was one of Augustine's concerns after Pelagius was acquitted by the Council of Diospolis. In explaining his statement that human beings can be without sin if they want, that's one of the charges that Pelagius was brought up on, Pelagius clarified that he meant, here's what he said. He said, actually, I meant that those who have turned away from sin can, by their own effort and the grace of God, be free from sin. So Pelagius says, actually, I meant those who have turned away from sin can, by their own effort and the grace of God, be free from sin. Now that sounds good, right? I think just if that were written on a piece of paper, all of us would be able to sign off on that as Reformed. But Augustine suspects that there's more to Pelagius' statement than that it appears. And if the bishops had known this, they might have been able to press Pelagius on this point. Augustine said, it is still not clear from these words what he means by the grace of God. So now Augustine zeroes in on the definition of grace put forward by Pelagius. See, here's the gotcha moment. Augustine had read Pelagius' book. He wrote a book called Nature. And that book, the bishops at Diospolis had not read, right? Remember, they spoke Greek. They didn't really read Latin. So they hadn't read any of the works of Pelagius. And in that book, Nature, Pelagius had defined grace as the fact that our nature received the ability not to sin when it was created, since it was created with a free choice. So in other words, for Pelagius, there's no separation in time between the creation and redemption. There is really no need for redemption for Pelagius, because all of the grace that we need for Pelagius was created in us when God created us with free will and with the ability not to sin. So Augustine zeroes in on this point and points out this nature-grace confusion in Pelagius' theology. Augustine says, this grace is not nature, correcting Pelagius now, this grace is not nature, but a help to our fragile and weakened natures. This grace, he says, is neither the nature that is dying, nor the letter that kills, but the spirit that gives life. Which brings us to the last point here, a very brief point. For Pelagius, grace is not only nature, but grace is the law. Or you say the law is grace. So here's how Augustine explains this. He, meaning Pelagius, locates the grace and help of God, which helps us not to sin either in nature and free choice, that's the grace is nature thing, or in the law and teaching. Thus, when God helps one to turn away from evil and do good, Pelagius thinks that God helps by revealing and showing us what to do, but not by cooperating with us and pouring love into us so that we do not know what we should do. So that we do what we know we should do. So, in other words, Pelagius is arguing that when God tells us what to do in the Bible through the Ten Commandments, the exhortations of Paul, that is also God's grace, because God is telling us what we should do, and so that's grace for Pelagius, right? It doesn't make sense to us. Our reformed minds, our head wants to explode, right? It does not compute territory for reformed people. but this is what Pelagius was teaching. So this is in a lot of ways, in all ways, I think, this is the exact opposite of what we teach today. Obviously, we, as Reformed people, and one of the things the Reformation was about is a fight over whose side Augustine was on. Because the Catholics were saying, well, Augustine is on our side, and Luther insisted, no, Augustine had all of these doctrines of grace, and your theology is looking more like the Pelagian theology of the 5th century, and we think that our theology reflects what Augustine was teaching in his anti-Pelagian writings. So this is very much our heritage. But are there any questions about Pelagius' view? Because that's all I really have. Yeah?
Well, I just wondered if you give any background information about each camp's view of Scripture. Obviously, Augustine has the Scripture a type lens. Does Pelagius believe that you look into the logic within you, human, the light of nature, maybe more so even than Scripture? What was in the air in those days in terms of how you use the Bible?
Yeah, you know what? That's a great question. I'm not really sure. I don't know a lot about Pelagius. Like we said, I don't think any of his writings survive. So all we have to go on is Augustine. Of course, Augustine thinks he's being very biblical and tries to be very biblical. I'm sure that Pelagius thought he was being very biblical too. Obviously, obedience is a vital part of the Bible. And so my guess is that Pelagius was just focusing in on different scriptures than Augustine would be. And he wasn't, of course, Augustine, obedience was important for Augustine too, right? I think Augustine would look at Pelagius and say, right, you're right on being concerned for obedience, but there's all this other stuff about God's grace that you're missing. Yeah. Yeah.
It's an interesting, it seems like an interesting consequence of what he's saying about having no disposition. So in other words, if my choice between chocolate and vanilla is completely arbitrary, what I was thinking about is it makes it difficult to understand how we can really love God.
Say more.
Because love is a disposition. Our obedience is out of love for God. It flows out of something in us, as opposed to simply, if my choice between chocolate and vanilla is simply, I saw somebody else having chocolate and thought it might be an interesting thing to try, it almost removes the whole moral dimension, you see what I'm saying, from the choice.
Yeah.
It's like, in the interest of trying to make us moral, it makes us amoral, not immoral, but
amoral. Yeah, right. No, and I think somebody who held the libertarian free will would probably look at that and say, wait, but actually shouldn't we be given more credit if we don't have a disposition to do something and we do it anyway out of the sheer power of our own will? Right? It's like, you might not like giving your wife flowers on Valentine's Day, but I'm sure you love it.
How'd you know that?
But you probably do it anyway, right? Or whatever, chocolates, And so Pelagius might look at that and say, well, shouldn't we be given more credit for doing something that we're not inclined to do?
But that assumes disinclination.
That's
something against my inclination, not the absence of inclination.
Yeah, see, this is the problem with libertarian free will. This is why most philosophers today do not hold the libertarian free will, because even trying to explain it doesn't really make any sense. It just makes all of your decisions to be basically like a randomness. And it makes a lot more sense to say that I go into the ice cream shop and I have the choice between chocolate and vanilla, and I choose chocolate because I like chocolate and I hate vanilla, right? And so then the Christian life is like, oh, I used to love sinning and I used to hate honoring God, but then the Holy Spirit changed my affections, and now I love honoring God, and I hate sinning, right? And there's that complicated thing there of already and not yet, but that's kind of the gist of it. So yeah, now that's a great question, and if you heard me try to explain libertarian free will, it's hard to explain because it doesn't even really make sense, I don't think. So thank you. Any other questions? Yeah, George?
Something about his argument on grace, you explained it doesn't make much sense, is he speaks of grace as kind of an innate neutrality, and yet the Bible speaks of times where grace abounds, but neutrality isn't something that can be quantitative. It's a switch. It's on or off. It's not something that you can't abound in neutrality. You either are or you're not.
Neutrality abounding to the chief of sinners. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Well, just if his view is that grace was about how God made us neutral or free agents with no inclination one way or another.
Yeah. Pelagius would say
the Bible
that
speaks of grace in a quantitative way sometimes, where there can be more or less.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
But
I think that's the least of Pelagius's concerns. Yeah, it's so, I mean, if you read Scripture, it's so clear that man is never neutral, but that he's Adam and Eve, right? There's that period of innocence. There's that time where there's that fuzzy period of kind of neutrality. But then after the fall, right, man is never neutral. And it's so clear, every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continuously from his youth, right? There are no more qualifiers that you could add to that. So, yeah, I think Pelagius has a lot of problems. Yeah, Martha?
Obviously, Pelagius never had a toddler because all you have to do...
Well, he was a monk.
They don't learn to have a tantrum or to defy the parent from the people they're with all the time, their
Right.
parents. That comes out of their heart. So, and they're not choosing good or evil, they're just going based on, I want and I can't see past what I want.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I don't have any children, but I hear that's the case. Yeah. Jeff?
What's interesting is
I was, yeah.
There's a wing in neurobiology that's basically coming out and saying, of course we don't have free will. So it's no longer a question of abstract theology, it's a question of evolutionary biology. So everything that we are, and therefore all the choices that we make, were downloaded into us like a program through natural selection, which I think is kind of an interesting development on the scientific side, because in its own roundabout way, it's something of an unintentional endorsement of our relationship to Adam, even though, of course, those who are promoting it aren't promoting it with any theological agenda at all. In fact, would be contrary to it.
Yeah.
So we're not free. Of course we're not free.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't heard that. But we all like to think we're free, right? And we live as though we're independent, arbitrary wills. But when we stop and think about it, we realize how much of our actions are conditioned by things we like or don't like, that we just like or don't like them, or things that our parents did that now we do, and we realize how predictable we are. And that can be kind of a scary thing, but it's also, I think, when you think of it in terms of, God's grace God's grace, that's what He does. He's in the business of changing people's dispositions. And helping us to be able to freely make choices that are in accordance with our own nature that we would never have made on our own as children of Adam. So, yeah. All right, any other questions? I think our time is up. All right, well, let's close in prayer. Father, thank you for Augustine. Thank you that he was able to powerfully defend the doctrines of grace and the biblical doctrines of man from the threat of false teaching. We pray that our own teaching would come under scrutiny of the Bible, and that you would help us to become more and more in alignment with the Bible, and in areas that maybe our thinking or certainly our lives don't align with the Bible, that you would help us to correct that by the power of the Spirit. We thank you for your grace that even though on our own we have no hope of coming to you as natural people, we thank you that you have persuaded us and enabled us to see the beauty of Jesus Christ and to come to Him and embrace Him and to be in Him. And we thank you for this inestimable gift. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, thank you.